Alright guys, welcome into Formula 1 news, a day that many thought would never arrive in the world of F1. Lando Norris wins a Grand Prix for the first time in honestly rather dominant fashion. His first victory of his career. Max Verstappen says it is not going to be the last, especially because McLaren brought major upgrades this weekend. They may have seriously changed the tide of the rest of the season to come. What a race today. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. Absolute scenes. So many storylines. Beginning here, to be fair. Adrian Newey was on the grid today, looking at the Ferrari, looking at the Mercedes. This is what he does. Also having a brief conversation with Mario Andretti. There has been some talk that for Adrian Newey, his next adventure in the sport, okay, is it going to be Ferrari? Probably, if he's going to go anywhere. Could be Aston, but unlikely. Could be Mercedes, unlikely. Could be McLaren. I mean, that would be very interesting on the results of today. Of course, going back to McLaren when he won a couple of championships with them back in 98, 99 with Mika Hakkinen. Maybe there's something though with Andretti if they're trying to come into the sport. Maybe you can't completely rule it out, because when Newey joins what became Red Bull with Jaguar, that was not expected to be an especially competitive outfit. We know how that has gone. Before the day though, McLaren were interested, well, involved, let's say, in some controversy, not involving this, but because it's, Mr. Donald Trump, he turned up to the track, and we heard about rumours, I talked about this on a video maybe a few days ago now, that he was going to do some sort of, like, not rally exactly, but he was going to get some sort of suite, do like a campaigning type thing, and here he is with Zach Brown, looking at the McLaren, having a chat in the garage, and it's quite remarkable, right, how the day ended up turning out, because obviously Trump was using this as a nice campaign piece. Here's Zach Brown on the right hand side. I know that he had to make some comments publicly to say, well, you know, we're not a political entity, but we, you know, welcome a former president, all this stuff. So, and in the end, of course, quite a day it turned out for McLaren in remarkable fashion. Let's just mention this for you guys real quick. This was last year's Miami Grand Prix. Now, just take a second to breathe this in. Lando last year was P17, Oscar was P19 last year in Miami. McLaren had arguably the worst car at the start of last season. In Bahrain, it was bad, and it made that decision that Norris has made to stick with those guys rather than go to Red Bull, where the opportunity has been there, and they've been very clear that if Lando wanted to join Red Bull, he could have done exactly that. He decided not to. That decision has been criticised widely, and maybe the result of today doesn't really change that in the grand scheme of things if they can't back it up. But you can totally see why Lando is stuck with this team, and especially compared to, shall we say, Mercedes. The progress that has been made at McLaren compared to Mercedes over the last 12 months has been absolutely night and day. They brought a major upgrade last year in Austria that spent them, well, quite a way forward on the grid. We saw that arrived for Lando last year and not for Oscar completely. It's a similar story this year. And Oscar today was very competitive despite not having the full upgrade package, and that is the piece to me that makes this very interesting. Yes, Red Bull didn't clearly get the car in the way that they wanted it, but we now have had two Grand Prix this season in Australia, where Max may have won, but quite possibly not, if his engine, of course, well, his brakes didn't have an issue, and he was out of the Grand Prix. And now it's here in Miami, where quite clearly they were not the fastest car on the day. This, though, is turn one, and I can't believe what Perez is thinking here, to be honest, because this happened, this from Crimsix in the crowd, this happened in the sprint race, right, where Perez went in very deep, sent it off the track. The same thing happens here. Big lock up from Checo, ends up off the track here as well. Nearly takes out Max. I mean, this was a crazy turn one. Like, this race could have been over for Max before it began, because here comes Perez so deep into turn one. Now, the interesting thing was Leclerc got a very poor start here. All sorts of wheel spin. He was swallowed up by Piastri, swallowed up by Sainz. But then because Perez comes steaming through, nearly takes out Max clean, and then Sainz has to get out of the way. That then allows Leclerc back into P2, and Piastri takes advantage of the situation. So this was the start. Obviously, we saw the chaos yesterday 4 wide with Hamilton and the rest of the guys. The Astons and Norris. Of course, Norris was spun around in the sprint. We knew this weekend the McLaren was good. It was clear on the Friday. The McLaren had lots of pace. It looked like Lando was going to stick it on pole in sprint qualifying, but the soft tyres caught them off guard, and he failed to deliver. And again, there were questions raised. Well, you know, here goes Norris again. An opportunity is there, and he fails to grasp it. We've seen that several times. Today was a completely different story, and it was wonderful to see. And these are the two McLarens. Going into today, the talking point was really, can the two Ferraris put together a challenge to beat Max? Like, let's say they can, you know, hold off Perez, they can maybe pull some strategy on Max if he doesn't have insane pace. I think it was quite clear from the sprints that the Red Bull didn't have ridiculous pace this weekend compared to, let's say, what we saw in China. But out of nowhere, really, we weren't talking so much about the McLarens. We'd seen they had pace race on Friday, but after they qualified P5, P6 for the Grand Prix, it's like, well, more than likely they will not be fighting for the victory. But that is, of course, not what we saw as the Grand Prix continued. So this is Perez getting oh so close to wiping out Max in the first corner. This is also, I think, a question for Red Bull, because on the weekends where the Red Bull hasn't been absolutely imperious, Perez has dropped back quite considerably. That, I think, is the concern if you're Red Bull about keeping Perez around. On the weekends where the Red Bull is dominant, Perez can be P2, P3, no problem. But on a weekend like this, P5 today isn't terrible, but it's not great. And it was a similar story in Australia, really, when the car isn't really on point, he just doesn't have enough really to be putting it on the podium in those circumstances, like of course Max does. So the Grand Prix continues. Max pulls a bit of a lead, but it wasn't exactly, he wasn't driving away into the distance. So the race was still on. I mean, even, before the safety car happens, the race was alive had something happened, but I think it was quite clear that we did need some sort of safety car intervention to make a change here. This was the moment. You can see Max a few laps into the Grand Prix, not exactly miles ahead of the rest of the guys, but Piastri, he got the move done on Leclerc, and this was quite telling, right? Because Piastri doesn't have the full upgrade package this weekend. They brought part of the upgrades. They brought 9 or 10 to Lando's car. They don't have all of those for Oscar. But it's quite clear that these upgrades work, and they work very well, because Piastri did a great job today. Unfortunate, really unfortunate that he couldn't finish in the points after the contact with Sainz. That we'll certainly get into. Hamilton as well was having another battle with a Haas. He got the move done on Hulkenberg, then he locked up into the final corner, gave the place back, then obviously he got it back again a couple of laps later. That lost him lots of time though in the fight further up the field. I'm not sure the pace was really there on the hard tyres, but it was there on the mediums. So this was towards the end of the first stint. Lando Norris is coming up to the back of Sergio Perez and putting serious pressure on. It actually felt like Lando was going to pass Perez here, but of course Checo went into the pits. So the Red Bull's tyre deck wasn't quite where they would have liked it. Lando's pace was clearly rather mesmerisingly good, and it was like, wow, Lando's on for maybe a P2, P3 here, given where he started, because of the pace that he had at the time. And honestly, from this point onwards, he was faster than Max Verstappen every single lap of the Grand Prix, bar none. And we'll see the numbers on that in a second. This also happens. Max made an uncharacteristic mistake and barreled over the chicane. It's a very clumsy chicane, but he took out the bollard, which I think everyone has done on the F1 game a million times. He takes it out and he doesn't just throw it off to the side. It's not like he can choose, right? But his car doesn't chuck it off to the side. He takes the corner, the bollard then falls off, basically on the racing line. It was near enough on the racing line, and I'm pretty sure some, probably wind from cars and stuff, brushed it back onto the racing line. There was a forced VSC, and this could have been perfect for Max. I don't think it damaged his car. The Red Bull guys seem to believe that it didn't. Maybe there was some very slight damage, but didn't seem like that was the case. But anyway, the marshals under a VSC picked it up, got it all sorted. But a VSC lasted maybe 45 seconds to a minute, and given where the car were on track, Verstappen, Norris and the others that hadn't yet pitted, they couldn't pit onto the VSC and save about 10 seconds. So they were forced to stay on and go long, and it was quite clear that Norris's strategy was going to be to go really deep into the Grand Prix. Got to lap 28, 29 on a set of medium tyres, and even Hamilton, he got rid of the hards on lap 27 because it was quite clear the mediums could easily last 30 plus laps, and the mediums were faster, so why not get rid of the hards earlier? Because typically you think, all right, 60 laps, let's do 40 on hards, 20 on mediums or something, but actually sometimes it makes sense to do more on mediums if they go that far, if they're just the superior tyre. So Max comes into the pits. Lando Norris then takes over the lead of the Grand Prix. This was the case. Verstappen was 10 seconds or so behind Norris, and he'd pitted already. So realistically, Norris was going to have a very hard time winning this race. He had a legit incredible pace, but in this circumstance, given where he started, winning was probably off the cards until the safety car. But he was closing in on Sainz, closing in on Piastri. These guys all pitted. Norris then led the Grand Prix, and then the safety car happened. Kevin Magnussen, man, you've got to respect this guy. He's keeping the sport interesting at the moment. He had so many penalties, and I think there was a point in this Grand Prix, he went probably 10 or 15 minutes without getting a penalty, which might be a first for him this weekend. But he takes out Sargent. Feel bad for Sargent, home Grand Prix. There's been rumours that it might be his last Grand Prix. I don't know if that's true, but, there's rumours that they want to kick him out and put Antonelli in the car. We'll see about that. This was the screenshot. from this POV, it kind of looks like, well, maybe he's got room to go for this. But Sargent was ahead at the previous apex, and the rule is that if you're ahead at the previous apex going into a chicane like this, you're not entitled to the space on the inside. And, well, even though he's kind of alongside, Sargent is entitled here by the rules to the racing line, and Magnussen just sends it. They crash. Magnussen actually survives and can continue the Grand Prix, but Sargent was out of the race. And this was a quick safety car. This was perfect for Lando and for the others that hadn't stopped, because they could come into the pits. Perez actually pitted again, which made sense, but Lando could come in, put on a set of hard tyres, the same as Max was on, a couple of laps fresher, and lead the race from then on out. And it was the perfect moment for McLaren. You know, the patience paid off. The strategy was very well executed. It was also kind of dramatic because I think Bert Mylander, the FIA safety car driver, he thought, as maybe you might expect, Max was leading. So he actually picked up Max when he came out of the pits with the safety car as the leader of the Grand Prix. And then he was told, hang on, Max ain't leading like usual. Lando's leading. So then they had to let all the cars through, and then he went to pick up Lando. So that was kind of entertaining. And it did mean, to be fair, that those tyres got to live a couple extra laps without too much work into them. But Lando was basically on a fresh set of boots here right out of the gate. So it was pretty obvious that Lando was going to pull a bit of a gap. The question I had was that maintainable? Was it the case that Norris could maintain this gap over time? Would Verstappen come back at him? Because in the first stint, the gap between Piastri and Verstappen was pretty stable at like 3 or so seconds. It's not like Max was driving away and Piastri didn't have the full upgrade package that Norris had and doesn't have the race pace that Norris does. So I was thinking, wow, this could be very interesting indeed, and that's what it turned out to be. Even Hamilton was putting pressure on Perez. Like, I mean, Hamilton was on the mediums in the final stint, Russell was on the hards, but after the safety car, I think Hamilton put about 20 seconds, basically a second lap, I think, on George Russell during the Grand Prix. And sure, tyre delta, but Hamilton was on it this weekend, and he wasn't far off actually beating Perez. He was asking for everything they had, and he put a serious challenge in. And that's the thing, when the Red Bull wasn't so strong, all of a sudden the Mercedes in the hands of Hamilton was actually a pretty competitive animal. But around about this point, lap 39, it became clear that Lando was the heavy favourite at this point for the Grand Prix. Verstappen said, the car won't turn, it's a disaster. We know what usually happens after Max says this. He absolutely cooks them for the rest of the Grand Prix. That did not happen on this occasion, and Norris held on very impressively. So this was Piastri, by the way, with Sainz. This was controversial for sure. Sainz was not happy and took out revenge effectively on Piastri a few corners later here. But yeah, Piastri, Sainz was going around the outside. Piastri sent it very deep and very much forced Sainz off the road. But Oscar did have the inside line. It's his corner. And by the stewarding rules, well, force the other driver off the track, yes, but if it was your corner, that's fine. The other driver isn't entitled to the space necessarily if certain parameters aren't in place. It's very complicated, the rules, what's allowed, what's not allowed. Often the stewarding decisions feel very arbitrary. But in this case, they decided no further action, and Sainz therefore said, all right, you know what, you can have it back, Oscar, and was just going to send it down the inside of him here, made contact, broke Oscar's front wing, and yeah, Sainz could not get the car stopped in time. Piastri then had to pit, which is very unfortunate, and he made a decent comeback drive, but it wasn't enough to get into the point to the end of the Grand Prix. And in the meantime, Oscar, while making moves, was getting told on the radio, like, do not cause a safety car, whatever you do, because Lando's leading by like 5 seconds. We need no safety car, green flag from here to the end, don't do anything stupid, and Piastri certainly obliged on that one. There was a nice battle as well between Alonso and Ocon. We often see this, and fair play to Ocon securing the first points of the season for Alpine today, which was, yeah, maybe been a bit of a long time coming, but yeah, Lando, there was all this, it was concern, right? There was nervous energy because Lando was a few laps away. Was his power unit going to break down? Like, was he going to make some sort of error? Because it is a street track at the end of the day. One small error, you're off, you're locking up, you could be in the wall, right? Like, we've seen it before. And Lando just had to hold his own, not make any mistakes at the end of the Grand Prix, and that's exactly what happened. What a day, right? Because we've been talking about this for a long time. Sochi 2021 lives long in the memory of Lando Norris fans. When it looked like that victory was there, the rain comes down, they bottle the decision-making, and, Norris hasn't been able to live that down for the last few years. But Norris said, going into the season, Norris said, we talked about it before the year began, that he was going to win a race this year. He was confident in that McLaren, and the year started with the McLaren looking okay, but it looked like McLaren hadn't quite made the step that the other teams have. But once again, these mid-season upgrades have arguably transformed their car. It's only one track, so I don't want to get ahead of myself too much. But this performance today from Norris was emphatic. Like, he beat Verstappen on pure pace here. Like, yes, Verstappen's tyres were a couple of laps older, but let's be real, he dunked like 8 seconds on him after the safety car. Leclerc was only a couple of seconds off Max as well, so the Red Bull wasn't in top form today. Norris was frankly imperious after that point. He may have won the race anyway. Like, it is possible he could have won the race anyway, but after the safety car, there was absolutely no stopping him. And yeah, it's one track. But if McLaren can maintain this kind of performance level, it makes the season really interesting from now on out. So Verstappen P2, Leclerc, Sainz, Perez, Hamilton, Tsunoda with a great drive to P7 actually. That went very much under the radar, I thought, today. Russell dropped back like 8 seconds on him, so he was P8. Then Alonso. Ocon gets a point for Alpine. There's the standings, by the way, the numbers on the left-hand side if you guys couldn't quite see that on the previous screen. And the reaction here was just great, right? So Lando goes in for the crowd surfing with the team, and we see the reaction from the other drivers as well. I thought it was great to see. We know that Lando, very well liked driver among the paddock by the other drivers, good friends with Max, and it's funny that Max, like, he didn't even, well, he wasn't annoyed, I don't think, by losing, but he didn't even pretend to be annoyed. He was just straight up basically saying, yeah, well done, Max, well done, Lando. He knew that, you know, it was a good time, it was a good day for the sport in general, and as he says, it's not going to be his last one, because, sure, Norris is a great driver who will win more Grand Prix, I'm sure. The question is, does that happen this season? Is this a sign of things to come for the rest of the year? So we had this from Charles, from Carlos, from the other drivers, congratulating Lando, even I think from Hamilton during like the cooldown lap when he was just waving and saying congrats to Lando, because of course they've had their, you know, battles and comments between each other over the years. That incident a few years ago when Hamilton said, oh, Lando, what a great driver, and there was lots of reaction to that at the time. And these were the words from Lando after the fact, right, about time, and I think that is the key point, because 110 Grand Prix I think for Norris before he won his first race. I think for Rosberg it was 111, I think for Button it was maybe 113, something like that. So there's been lots of pressure on Lando to make, obviously, the decision that he's made, talking about how there's lots of pressure on him from choosing to stay at McLaren, for having those opportunities, even the last, you know, year or so when Piastri won the sprint in Qatar and it wasn't Lando because he messed up in qualifying when it really came down to it. And I was interested to see as well, like, let's say we had had a battle. Hopefully we do, because the last couple of years there's been lots of talk of, well, Norris, anytime he battles Max, he just lets him through. And I can understand why Norris has seemed to do that, because they're not in the same race. Today, they were in a legit fight for the win, and hopefully from now to the end of the season, we get at least a couple of on-track serious battles between Lando and Max for a race victory. That would be great to see, and honestly, it may well be happening. Here's Norris, by the way, on Twitter here. You know, we did it. He's probably already had a couple of things to drink, shall we say, with the misspellings there, but it's just great to see, isn't it? Like, what a day in the sport. And the question is, for me, what does this mean for the future of this season? These were the data, by the way, Verstappen versus Norris. This is the pit stop lap, of course. These are the lap times the early part of the Grand Prix where Verstappen was the fastest man, but Norris wasn't far behind given that he was in traffic. As soon as Lando got out of the traffic, look at these lap times. Every single lap from the end of the safety car to the end of the Grand Prix, he was faster by a relatively considerable margin. So it wasn't even close, really. Toto Wolff, what does he think about this? Because Mercedes have been embarrassed today. The fact that McLaren have gone from where they were 12 months ago to where they are today, and a customer team of Mercedes is cooking them in the championship standings, it ain't a good look. Hamilton actually wasn't too dissatisfied because he was like, wow, got a legit race in today, tried to battle with Perez, that was good fun, and I know that him and Bono shared a bit of a conversation as well. And as Button asked Verstappen, do you think this is the true pace of these guys? Max is like, I hope not. So I think that Red Bull clearly missed a trick this weekend. But it was interesting that they did well in the sprint, of course. They won in the hands of Max. And then they made a couple of tweaks, I think, for the Grand Prix, and it clearly didn't work quite as well. Max wasn't so happy with the balance. Norris most certainly absolutely was. So I think some really interesting things to look at here. And also it becomes on the weekends where Adrian Newey announced his departure. Now, not to say there's anything really in this, but it is just interesting to note that this year's Red Bull is seemingly not as dominant as last year's Red Bull on the evidence that we are seeing so far. Next year, of course, Newey's going to be gone, potentially to another team. Like, is this the start of where we see Max, no longer dominating Grand Prix by 25, 30 seconds and winning easily? Max is still going to win this championship. I don't think anyone's got any illusions about that. But what happens from now to the end of the year might be very telling in terms of what happens in next year's championship and potentially the way Max feels going into 2026 and also the way that Norris feels going into 2026 as well. So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.